Episode 130, Jonbenet case, that morning. Newsweek, focusing on the family. On Thursday morning, December 26, 1996, the Boulder, Colorado Police Department received a 911 call at 5:52 a.m. The caller, Patsy Ramsey, said her daughter, Jonbenet, had been kidnapped and there was a ransom note. When the first officer arrived 8 minutes later, he searched the house for the child and for any sign of forced entry, but found nothing. It was still dark outside. Hello? John Fernie said that he would be right over. Hello? Fleet White said he and Priscilla would be right over. Officer Rick French arrived at the Ramsey residence at 5:59 a.m. He got out of his car, looked around, went up to the front door, and knocked. Patsy Ramsey answered the door. He was let in. He talked to her momentarily, and then John Ramsey met him in the hallway and talked to him for several minutes. Then John Fernie arrived at the Ramsey house and parked in the back alley behind their house. And he came up to the back door and looked through and saw the ransom note on the floor. And he read what he could, saw that it was serious, and came around to the front of the house. Officer Rick French checked the house and went down into the basement and looked around down there. Then John Fernie came around to the front of the house and entered the residence. Fleet and Priscilla White arrived at the Ramsey house about 6:15 a.m. Sergeant Reichenbach arrived at the Ramsey house sometime around the same time that the Whites arrived, either a little before or a little after they arrived. Shortly thereafter, Barbara Fernie arrived at the house at about 6:20 a.m. Around this time, Fleet White checked out the basement. He went down there and saw the suitcase under the window. He found a shard of glass. Then he went to the wine cellar door, opened the door, looked in, and it was completely dark, and then closed the door and left. John Ramsey called his pilot, Michael Archuleta, but he didn't speak to him, and he left a message. And later, the pilot called back, and Patsy Ramsey answered the phone. And I guess she explained to him what was going on. The first crime victim advocate arrived at the Ramsey house at 6:30 a.m. The second victim advocate arrived later. Priscilla White called her house about 6:45 a.m. to check on her house guests and her two children. The Reverend Hoverstock arrived at about 7:10 a.m. Burke Ramsey, John Fernie, and Fleet White left the Ramsey house at about 7:15 a.m. Okay, that ends the timeline part of this video. I just wanted to mention this one thing. It says, I met with Patsy and asked her about her telephone conversation with her mother. Patsy told me that she had spoken to her mother after she had discovered Jonbenet missing. Some observations about this video. That morning, John Ramsey called the Fleet White House. That's what I got from a couple sources, which doesn't make sense to me, or seems impossible, because he was supposed to be in his underwear and going upstairs and getting dressed before the policeman arrived. So he wouldn't have time to do this, in my opinion. Did John Ramsey have a cell phone? There's one thing I realized. It seemed like there's a lot of phone calls being taken place, and it seems like John Ramsey might have been using his own personal business cell phone to call shortly after Patsy called 911. Why didn't John or Patsy check the basement? You have the police officer went down and checked the basement. You have Fleet White who went down and checked the basement. But yet neither of them, John or Patsy, went down immediately after finding the ransom note and checked the basement. And then last but not least, Patsy called her mother that morning, according to Linda Arndt. So when did that take place? Doesn't seem like that's possible, unless she called before she called 911 or something else. Again, it shows that the Ramseys are not being truthful about what happened that morning. Well, this ends this episode of Unsolved. And a few comments about this episode. I tried my best to put it in correct order and have the times all correct. But there's so many conflicting accounts of when things happened. So you might see something that says something different. But keep in mind that I most likely checked that out and found it to be wrong. For example, I don't know when Officer Carl Veach arrived at the Ramsey residence. Some accounts having him arriving with Rick French. In others, they're in separate vehicles. And I wasn't able to find out a lot of information about Veach, Officer Veach. So I left him out mostly because I didn't know what he did, what happened. The next episode will be tomorrow night, and it will deal with the Zodiac Killer. See you the next time. According to this article, at 5:55 a.m., the Whites were awakened by John Ramsey, who told them to hurry over. And according to his own book, he says similar thing. However, Patsy Ramsey said that he was in his underwear and he went upstairs to get dressed. There's no time for him to call Fleet White's house that morning. So I don't think he did that.